I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. This week, I'll talk with a reporter who covered South Carolina's latest execution, this time by firing squad, a method the state at first decided was cruel and unusual. He wrote about it in the Times. But first, David Enrich's new book, Murder the Truth. It arrives at a crucial moment as billionaires transform our government. My Times colleague sheds light on the concerted efforts underway to silence dissent, redefine free speech in America. The subtitle of the book is Fear the First Amendment and a Secret Campaign to Protect the Powerful. David, how secret is this campaign? We seem to be learning more and more about it every day.
Well, let me put it this way. When I started writing this book, it was a secret to me, and I think it was a secret to most of the public. But that was in 2022 that I started writing about this, and Trump was not on, or he had retreated from kind of a prominent position. He's since roared back, obviously, and I think this campaign has become a lot less secret than it once was. And what I found in the reporting was that all over the country, there has been this really concerted push, generally on the right wing, by activists, lawyers, judges, politicians, to really silence anyone that is writing or scrutinizing their activities in a negative way. And they're doing that by using legal threats and lawsuits to really intimidate journalists and members of the public. And that was something that I knew was happening. I knew there were incidents of this. I'd been on the receiving end of these things, so had many of my colleagues. What I didn't realize is that so much of this was deliberate and coordinated and with a broader aim than just kind of trying to get me or my colleagues individually to be quiet on a particular story.
You've been on the receiving end of this. Many reporters have. How has it affected your practice of the profession of journalism? Has it had a chilling effect at all? Has it made you think twice?
No, it hasn't had a chilling effect on me, I don't think. But, I sit, as you do, in a position of great privilege at the New York Times, where we have, relatively speaking, a ton of money. We have a family that controls the company that is committed for many generations now to protecting the First Amendment and being a strong bastion of free speech. And we also have, this may be the most important part of it, an awesome team of in-house lawyers who have our back at every turn. And so the New York Times is very experienced dealing with legal threats and lawsuits, and we do not get intimidated. We take these threats and complaints seriously, but we do not get intimidated by them. And the genesis of this book for me, in part, was that I was getting so many threats, my colleagues were getting so many threats, that I started wondering what it would be like at a smaller news outlet, or if you're an independent journalist, to be the one receiving those threats or those lawsuits. And what I quickly learned as I started my reporting was that the chilling effect at smaller places and independent places is very real, and it's growing.
I read the other day that a professor at Columbia Journalism School has advised international students not to write about the Middle East or Gaza or even Ukraine for fear that the federal government will somehow react to that. You said you've been on the receiving end of threats. What kind of threats do people make, and who?
Well, it varies. The thing I was referring to just then was that there's this growing group of very high-powered lawyers that specialize in threatening the media and suing the media, and basically they're basically acting on behalf of clients that are the subject of articles or investigations, and they really just they're trying to kill the articles, dilute the articles, and the threats come usually in letters that are sent on very fancy letterhead to me or to my colleagues and to our lawyers that basically say, look, you're getting your facts wrong, you're setting out to smear our clients, and if you do that, we are probably going to sue you. And it's a mixture of, and the letters, again, sitting at the New York Times, where we have a really good team of lawyers and we have a lot of experience dealing with this. In some ways, the letters are helpful because they lay out often a series of facts that the person or institution that we're writing about agrees with. And, look, sometimes in the reporting process, before we've published a story, we have our facts wrong. We're misunderstanding something, or we're lacking crucial context. And so getting the client, and that's the reason that we always, without fail, reach out to the person that we're writing about well before we publish to better understand their viewpoint. And
David, does it ever work in sort of a perverse way that you get a letter like this and you call the lawyers and say, okay, let me talk to the people who have refused to talk to me and get the story straight?
yeah, I mean, we always do that. And, usually the lawyer letters are, we've at that point already gone to the client and said, here's what we're planning to report about you. We want your response. And instead of them responding and having an open conversation with us, they sic their lawyers on us. But, again, this is something that we've grown accustomed to, but I think it's a much bigger threat for smaller and independent outlets.
As you pointed out in the Times Magazine, a lot of the framework for dealing with this by the courts stems from a case involving the New York Times. Tell us a little bit about Times versus Sullivan and how that has changed things.
Well, Times versus Sullivan, without going into all of the detailed history about it, is a case that was decided unanimously by the Supreme Court in 1964. And it established what's known as the actual malice standard, which means that if you are a public figure or a public official and you are suing someone for defamation, you need to prove a bunch of things. You need to prove, obviously, first and foremost, that you were defamed by inaccurate statements that were made. But on top of that, you also need to show that the person who made the inaccurate and defamatory statements did so either knowing that what they were writing or publishing was false, so in other words, they were lying, or they acted with reckless disregard for the accuracy of those statements. And it was a high bar that the Supreme Court set very deliberately because it wanted to create breathing room for journalists and others to be able to investigate and scrutinize and criticize powerful public officials, because that's the role of the media, to serve as a check on those people. And the concern was that if every time someone writes about you or writes about a powerful person, if you inadvertently get a fact or two wrong, if that opens you up to potentially ruinous litigation, that is going to really deter people from investigating powerful people. And so it's become it's a very important protection right now for freedom of the press.
A self-serving question, but how much breathing room should we have?
I think we should have enough breathing room that we are fearless in reporting aggressively on the people and institutions that hold the most power in our country. And look, if you lie about someone or if you're reckless about getting facts wrong, you are subject to possibly getting sued. And I don't see any problem with that, really. We should not be able to lie with impunity. We should not be able to just recklessly be smearing people. I don't think journalists do that very often, but if and when that happens, we for sure should be held to account for that. I mean, there are plenty of examples in the book about instances where that has happened, and where there are lawsuits, successful lawsuits, brought against major news outlets. And I never like to see that happening to another journalist or another news outlet, but sometimes when someone's reputation gets severely damaged by deliberate falsehoods, I think the libel law in this country exists for a reason, and it's because back in many centuries ago, the solution to this kind of stuff was like taking it out on like a dueling ground. And so we have a legal system that's in place that creates a very, I think, civil and productive and efficient way of dealing with most of these cases.
Better than dueling, I would say.
Better, yeah, a little
indeed.
better.
You pointed out in the Times article that the states usually set their own libel standards, but the Supreme Court stepped in this case because Alabama had set a standard that seemed to violate civil rights laws.
Right. Well, it was that Alabama and the history of New York Times versus Sullivan, just in a very quick nutshell, is that the New York Times ran a full-page ad paid for by supporters of Martin Luther King, and it detailed this litany of abuses that Southern officials were perpetrating in their efforts to preserve white supremacy in the South. And the gist of the ad, it was fundamentally true, but there were some factual inaccuracies. And so Southern officials, in this case a guy named L.B. Sullivan, who was one of the city commissioners in Montgomery, Alabama, he decided, along with other people, that he was going to use lawsuits seizing on these small inaccuracies in articles to basically torpedo the New York Times and other major national news outlets' business model and sue them for enough money in front of very favorable, often racist, all-white juries in the South, and that by filing these weaponized lawsuits, they could extract such severe damages against these news outlets that it would be much simpler for them to just simply not cover the civil rights movement. And in fact, that's what happened. When L.B. Sullivan initially won his lawsuit against the New York Times, the Times pulled its reporters out of Alabama, and the Times' lawyers encouraged its reporters to steer clear of writing anything about like institutional racism in Alabama. So it was having a very clear and obvious chilling effect, and that was by design.
And of course, even if the press wins a case, the legal fees can be stupendous regardless. What about the courts now? How are they approaching Sullivan? Are they chipping away at it at all?
Well, they're not chipping away at it yet, but two of the Supreme Court justices, Clarence Thomas and Neil Gorsuch, have both indicated in opinions that they would like to overturn New York Times versus Sullivan. And they're all over the country. State and lower level federal judges have signaled that they agree with that. And in some cases, we're seeing that those disagreements popping up in official rulings when they are adjudicating defamation cases that clearly under New York Times versus Sullivan should be thrown out very swiftly at the district level. And sometimes they're not. Sometimes those cases are dragging on a lot longer than they should and subjecting news outlets, journalists, members of the public, activists of both parties to just a grueling legal process that, as you mentioned, can be enormously expensive, especially if you are not a big enough place to either have a lot of money or to be able to pay for libel insurance.
How much power does the Trump administration really have on this issue? Are these threats? Is it to create a chilling effect, or can they really carry through on a lot of this?
Well, the president cannot change the First Amendment and cannot change the Supreme Court's interpretation of the First Amendment. But I do think that, and first of all, Trump's rhetorical and legal attacks on the media have inspired hordes of copycats all over the country. And I've seen that firsthand in the reporting I did for this book. There are many cases where that has happened. And in addition to that, I think that there are a lot of actions that the White House has taken just in the past 2 months that are clearly designed to intimidate and in some cases kind of handicap news outlets that Trump perceives as writing unfairly about him.
And one of the interesting cases I thought was Paramount and CBS dealing with how 60 Minutes covered an interview with Kamala Harris. The parent company is waiting approval from a federal agency. CBS says, wait a minute, that shouldn't influence whether we have to reach a settlement or not. How do you reconcile those things?
I don't know. I don't think they're really reconcilable. CBS News' parent company needs the U.S. government's approval for a multi-billion-dollar merger that will greatly enrich the shareholders of Paramount. CBS News and 60 Minutes journalists, first of all, did nothing wrong here. The full transcript and full video of their interview with Kamala Harris is now public. It was not deceptively edited. That's not my opinion. That's just a fact. It was not. And so they view this lawsuit as garbage, and they are, I think, mortified that their corporate owners might cave into the Trump administration simply because they are trying to complete a very large business transaction.
How has the press generally reacted or created a bulwark for itself? More libel insurance? You point out that reporters are relying more on encrypted communications.
Yeah, there are all sorts of things like that happening either in public or behind the scenes. I think there is a really broad and growing concern among media lawyers, media executives, journalists, that the actions that the Trump administration has taken in the first 2 months of this administration are really just a taste of things to come, and that could get really serious really fast. And we've got Kash Patel running the FBI. He has explicitly said that from that perch, he would like to use his powers to pursue journalists. We've got the FCC also taking investigative actions against news outlets that have been critical of Trump.
And so networks.
Yeah, and networks. This could really escalate quickly into some uncharted terrain. And I think there are, and just among lawyers alone, I think they are really trying to kind of prepare legal motions in advance, things like that, so that when some of these actions take place, if they take place, they're ready to go to court immediately to challenge them.
We know that facts are protected. What about opinions? How far can you go in expressing an opinion? You mentioned in the story CNN case and even a case involving Henry Ford way back.
Yeah. Well, opinions are protected. What you can't do is use the kind of cloak of opinion to make false factual statements. But as long as your opinions are grounded in actual truthful facts, opinions are protected. And this is the point of the First Amendment. The framers of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights wanted to have a country where people were free to criticize and challenge those in power. And it was a direct response to their experience and the forefathers' experiences with England, and feeling that it was a censorious government that was controlling them way too much. And that's an ethos that is, I think, has really defined what makes America great, which is that we have unfettered free speech. People are able and willing to speak up and challenge those who hold power. And it's kind of wild to me to see how quickly those rights are coming under attack right now.
David Enrich of the New York Times. The book is Murder the Truth, Fear the First Amendment and a Secret Campaign to Protect the Powerful. Coming up next, covering an execution by firing squad. On March 7th, 2025, 67-year-old Brad Sigmund was executed by firing squad at the Broad River Correctional Institution in South Carolina. He was the first U.S. prisoner to die by that method in 15 years. AP reporter Jeffrey Collins has covered 11 executions in South Carolina, wrote about his latest experience in the New York Times this week. Jeffrey, is your beat death row? How come you've covered 11 executions?
My beat is all of South Carolina. Part of it is the law in South Carolina with the death penalty. They allow 3 people to witness any execution from the media, and it's the dominant wire service gets one of those slots. So we end up at the AP at every execution here. And I'm as our staffs have dwindled a little bit, there's not as many people here. So in the end, I just kind of am the person that ends up going to each of these executions. There's a different newspaper witness or a different television witness, but I'm the one wire service witness.
And you've written, and this is probably true, that you're the only one who has witnessed all 3 methods of execution, injection, and electric chair, and now firing squad.
I think so. That's the only 3. Those are the only 3 methods available for a long time. The U.S. has added the nitrogen method, where they put a mask on the prisoner and nitrogen is pumped into it, so essentially they suffocate. That's being done in Alabama, and a few other states are considering it, but they're doing it in South Carolina. But I say that to say, I checked with my colleague in Alabama, and she'd only done a lethal injection and the nitrogen. So yeah, I think I'm the only one that's seen a lethal injection, electric chair, and firing squad.
Is there one that is more cruel or unusual than the other, whether you want to inflict the death penalty or not?
The South Carolina Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court by default has said all 3 are okay. They don't get, you can do all 3, and none of them are cruel and unusual. They're different. A lethal injection is much more, sterile in a way. It takes a little longer. It's certainly not. Both the electric chair and the firing squad were very sudden and violent deaths, especially the firing squad. Everything happens in just like an instant.
What about from the prisoner's point of view? I mean, do you get any sense as to which is less onerous for a prisoner? Obviously, he or she dies at the end anyway.
I know, almost South Carolina, most states give prisoners a choice. And for decades, they've chosen, ever since lethal injection came around, they've chosen lethal injection. So, I mean, in a way, it's a difficult thing to figure out, because no one ever comes back and tells us what happened. So that's the whole difficulty in this, what kind of pain is inflicted, we just don't know. I think there's been an argument made and I know there's a prisoner in Georgia who asked and the court turned him down to have a firing squad because he didn't want to have a lethal injection either. There's some arguments that go on right now in court that, pentobarbital, which is the drug that they use for lethal injection, one of the things it does is it creates a rush of fluid into the lungs. And so, as people that have suffered that before say they feel like they're drowning. So there've been a number, recently in the last few years, there's been a number of court cases and inmates that don't want to feel like they're being waterboarded or drowned. So it's started to tilt a little more towards some other alternative methods, but right now lethal injection seems to be the choice.
Who does the shooting?
In South Carolina, it's 3 volunteers. They're all prison department employees. They volunteer for the duty. They're all given live ammunition. I know that thought about firing squads over the years is somebody gets a blank, so nobody is certain they were responsible. But in South Carolina, they've chosen to give all three live ammunition, and it's 3 volunteers. They stand 15 feet away, which is the distance from a basketball backboard to the free throw line, and they all shoot at the same time.
You wrote that the man who was executed, Bragg Sigmund, killed his ex-girlfriend's parents with a baseball bat. When was that?
That was in 2001.
So how did it take 24 years for him to get executed?
Part of it is all the protections in the court system. Death row inmates get a number of appeals. In fact, all the way up to the end, the final appeal for Bragg Sigmund was rejected by the U.S. Supreme Court 3 hours before his execution. Part of that, too, is a little bit of a unique situation in South Carolina. The state had like a 13-year unintended moratorium on the death penalty because they couldn't get the lethal injection drug. The supply from the mid-2010s expired, what they had, and then no one would sell it to them because companies refused to sell states lethal injection drugs unless their names can remain secret. So South Carolina struggled for several years to pass some kind of shield law that would protect that information, and that's how we ended up with a firing squad, because when they had struggles with getting the shield law passed, then they passed a firing squad as an alternative, and then they got the shield law passed. So right now we have 3 methods of execution. Their protocols, how they're doing it, is kept secret under this new law.
What about something like the last meal or their opportunity to make a last statement before they're executed? Is that something that just goes on in the movies?
No, in South Carolina, you do a lot of states let inmates make their final statements themselves. In South Carolina, they don't. The inmate's lawyer or the prison warden reads their final statement. And there is a final meal here in South Carolina, but it's the prison of like hours before. Instead, they provide it like Wednesday or Thursday. We have executions on Friday, so a day or two before. And the thought is, if you were going to have a last meal, would you rather have it 2 hours or have a chance to enjoy it?
I guess that makes some sense. I would ask for vintage 2030 wine or something like that, just anything as an excuse. Should executions be televised, either as a deterrent to other potential criminals or to shock people into opposing capital punishment?
That's an interesting question I've given a lot of thought to, actually. I don't know if I go with a deterrent thought or that, but my personal thought is when the government does something in general, it's kind of a journalist thing, it should be done in the public. It should be done where people can see it. It should be done where things can be seen. And but then on the other side of things, I don't know if it's fair to make it a spectacle, like a public spectacle. And it would become that, especially the first or second or third ones that are publicized and made live. Now, is there a place where maybe you could record them and make sure they're under seal, so I'm not the only one relating what happens? So like if you're an attorney, you can see these things for an inmate or something. That might be some middle place, but yeah.
Pretty amazingly, you wrote in the Times that there are still 27 other inmates on death row in South Carolina.
Remarkably enough, when South Carolina, the last execution before the 13-year pause was in 2011, and there were like more than 60 inmates on death row. South Carolina, like most places, went through this tough on crime phase where they, in the late 1990s, early 2000s, where a lot of people ended up on death row. But most of those folks ended up either having appeals that cut their sentences to life. There were a number of folks that just died, just ended up old age or whatever. And so, yeah, South Carolina still has 27 inmates on its death row. But, I think we have 2 more executions that got like bottled up during the little pause. We have those 2 coming up in the spring. But after that, it may be a little while before South Carolina has another one.
You witnessed all these executions, 11 of them. This was the first one with a firing squad. How was that different to see? Put us in that room for a moment, if you can.
The biggest difference, well, it's much more violent and sudden because, like, a lethal injection, you're watching, it unfolds in about a minute. There's like a couple of deep breaths, maybe a snore. You watch someone slowly stop breathing, and then you're sitting there for another up to 15 or 20 minutes waiting for everything to cease, right? Like, and then the doctor to come in and declare the inmate's dead. But during that time, there's no breathing or movement. This happens very suddenly. And there's a tension in there for a firing squad that there isn't for a lethal injection, because once the inmate's final statement is read, the prison employee comes in and puts a hood over the inmate's head and then walks over and opens the shade where the shooters are. And so at that point, you're waiting. But it was like 90 seconds to 2 minutes before the shot was fired. So everybody in that room is just waiting to hear the crack of that rifle. You can see the inmate has a hood on, but you can see them breathing. You can see a couple of deep breaths in there like that, and they didn't do a countdown. So the shot just rang out. Like you're sitting there waiting, and then you hear the crack and the target. They placed a target over the inmate's heart, and that just disappeared. Then after a moment or two, you could see a red spot, maybe the size of a small fist, in that spot, and it looked like the inmate took a couple of breaths. But firing squad is much more sudden and much more violent than a lethal injection.
And what did his lawyer say in his final statement?
The Brad Sigmund said that he had become a much better Christian over his 20 plus years on death row. So it was a religious call to end the death penalty, that there is no, that the New Testament of the Bible says that we shouldn't kill another person, and that the death penalty is a very Old Testament thing, and we should follow the New Testament.
Thank you, Jeffrey Collins of the Associated Press in South Carolina, writing in the New York Times. That's it for this edition of Close Up, and for the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts. And don't forget to download the CUNY TV app. You can catch our weekly program on the go, anytime, anywhere.